During the last major battle of World War I, with the German and Allied forces gathering their last bit of strength, the heroic actions of a single soldier made a difference in the outcome of the devastating war. Christian pacifist Sergeant Alvin Cullum York earned the Medal of Honor for bravely subduing enemy forces throughout the battles of the Meuse-Argonne in late 1918. In the course of the largest offensive in United States military history, involving 1.2 million men, Sergeant York took charge of his crippled squadron and attacked a German machine gun nest on his own, taking their guns and dozens of prisoners with him. His exploits led to the neutralization of a crucial site that supplied the Germans, giving way to their army's fall on the Western Front in northern France. For his actions, Sergeant York became one of the most decorated U.S. Army soldiers of World War I, and actor Gary Cooper even earned an Oscar for portraying him in a 1942 film about his life. But his story could have turned out differently. Coming from humble beginnings and with a severe drinking problem, Sergeant York eventually claimed conscientious objector status when drafted into the military and vowed not to engage in violence. Little did he know that his adventures would lead French Marshal Ferdinand Foch to tell him, quote, "What you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any soldier of all the armies of Europe." The Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The Grand Offensive, or the 100 Days Offensive, consisted of a series of concentric attacks on German lines in France from August to November of 1918. The 47-day Meuse-Argonne campaign became a pivotal part of the Grand Offensive. Its objective was to seize the railway hub in the French town of Sedan to disrupt the German-controlled tracks network between France and northern Belgium. The U.S. Army incorporated 12 battalions per division, in contrast to the British, French, and German forces with 9 each. But American officers realized that they would require more reinforcements, and as many as 22 divisions ended up participating in the conflict. The Meuse-Argonne offensive's logistics were planned by U.S. Colonel George Marshall, but the American troops served under French command. Prior to the Grand Offensive, the French army had replenished its forces and provided heavy equipment, including 2,780 artillery pieces, 380 tanks, and 840 aircraft. The American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, was a U.S. Army formation commanded by General John J. Pershing. It fought alongside other nations' armies on the Western Front and took part in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The campaign ultimately became the main confrontation of the AEF during World War I, with over 1 million American and French soldiers. The first phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive began on September 26th. American and French forces attacked several French towns along the Hindenburg Line from Reims to the Meuse, but were met with fierce German resistance. Several of the American divisions were shattered and had to be relieved, although some soldiers eventually re-entered the offensive. Meanwhile, the French troops were able to gain 9 miles from Sommepy to the northwest of Reims while fighting in better terrain conditions than the Americans. A second phase began on October 4th, when an American front assault managed to break through the primary German defenses along the Hindenburg Line. The Americans managed to forge ahead by 10 miles and took the Argonne Forest, while the French advanced 20 miles up to the Aisne River. The pieces were in place to continue on the offensive. Enemy defense. As the Meuse-Argonne offensive was underway, the opposing German forces were under strength. Their morale was especially low on the Western Front, where they had suffered continuous defeats. During the offensive's first phase, their forces added up to a mere 3,300 men. However, the Argonne Forest defense was resilient, and they were ready to fight to hold on to it. By October 7th, Lieutenant Paul Jürgen Vollmer, a highly decorated German officer, received confirmation that the Americans had penetrated their lines at Argonne. Vollmer's exhausted soldiers were now positioned near Châtel-Chéry after having endured a colossal hike while being harassed by American artillery. Still, he was feeling confident because elements from a Prussian Reserve Infantry Regiment had recently joined his battalion, just in time to withstand the Americans. In the meantime, the U.S. 82nd Division was preparing an attack on Castle Hill, or Hill 223. Vollmer could not let the Allies take that vital position, as they would have control over the entrance to that side of the Argonne Forest. Captain Heinrich Müller led a brigade that included the German 125th Württemberg Landwehr, the Guard Elizabeth Battalion, and the 47th Machine Gun Company to defend the hill with all their might. But the Germans' grip on the Argonne was endangered, and their forces were pushed back the hill's western slope. Both sides engaged in a fierce battle during the night, and the weakened Germans even tried to counterattack after the confrontation had reached a halt. Still, the American 82nd Division captured Castle Hill and also seized a secondary position, Hill 180. German General Max von Gallwitz immediately ordered to reinforce the troops by sending the 210th Reserve Infantry Regiment to assist in recapturing Castle Hill. Lieutenant Vollmer would lead the counteroffensive planned for the following day. While preparing their defenses, Lieutenant Fritz Endres spotted weak spots between the 4th Company and the 2nd Machine Gun Company. If neglected, the Americans would have no problem infiltrating the sector covered by the 2nd Company, solidifying their position. Vollmer was informed of the matter and ordered one of Endres' platoon leaders to establish liaison with the 2nd Machine Gun Company. However, he couldn't get through, and the Germans prepared to defend their positions. On the next day, October 8th, several Allied operations happened simultaneously. While the 77th U.S. Infantry Division was attempting to relieve their famous lost battalion, the 82nd and the 28th were advancing to secure control of the German communication artery and protect their fellow countrymen. Concurrently, General John J. Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force were carrying out the main attack in the Meuse River Valley. Pershing had sent his First Army to sever the German supply artery in Sedan. Somewhere else along the Hindenburg Line, the 2nd Battalion, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division, was spotted by German lookouts making their way to Castle Hill. The American troops' objective was to capture the Decauville rail line in the north-south road. But to get there, they had to cross the Ara River Valley, unaware that the Germans had positioned more than 50 machine guns to protect it. Among the Americans who were about to place a foot in the foggy valley was newly promoted Corporal Alvin Cullum York. No violence. The son of humble farmers, Alvin York was born in rural Tennessee in December of 1887, the third of 11 children. Since Alvin had to help support his family, he only attended school for 9 months and assisted his parents by fishing and hunting. But when his father died in 1911, he took charge of his younger siblings and set out to work as a blacksmith, a railroad constructor, and even a logger for some time. Despite being a regular churchgoer, Alvin was also a violent alcoholic, prone to fistfights in saloons. His Protestant mother tried many times to make him mend his ways. But it wasn't until his best friend died in a fight that it finally dawned on him, quote, "And then I was saved," Alvin wrote in his diary about his awakening in 1914. Alvin vowed to not engage in any sort of violent act ever again. At 29, the Selective Service Act drafted him for military service. When asked if he claimed exemption from the draft, he wrote ineloquently, quote, "Yes, don't want to fight." His claim was denied, and he submitted an appeal. Still, during World War I, a conscientious objector status granted no exemption from military duty. In 1918, Alvin was drafted to France. His commanding officers, Captain Edward Courtney Bullock Danforth and Major G. Edward Buxton, convinced him to reconsider his no-violence vows and reshaped his view on the morality of participating in the war. Alvin was eventually granted a 10-day leave to visit his home and returned to the army with the conviction that God's mission for him was to fight in the war. A heroic feat. Back with his fellow soldiers on the fateful morning of October 8, 1918, Corporal York's 2nd Battalion walked into the Ara River Valley to intense enemy fire. Lieutenant Vollmer's charge against the Americans was relentless, and it seemed like the Germans would stand their ground in the Argonne. York would later write, quote, "It was awful. Our losses were very heavy. The advancement was stopped and we were ordered to dig in. I don't believe our whole battalion or even our whole division could have taken those machine guns by a straightforward attack. The Germans got us, and they got us right smart." Corporal York was then summoned to infiltrate and silence the German machine guns, alongside 16 other soldiers, led by Acting Sergeant Bernard Early. While adjoining a squad to open fire against the Germans, Early's men made it through the enemy lines and approached them by the rear area. The 70-plus 120th German Regiment was having breakfast when York and his unit captured them. Lieutenant Vollmer was also taken prisoner, but a barrage of fire suddenly unleashed on them. The 4th and 6th German companies had seen what was happening and immediately attacked. Chaos ensued as the German prisoners spread and took cover while the Americans fired back. 6 U.S. soldiers lost their lives and 3 more were wounded, leaving York in command. He then took charge of the unit and ordered them to stay put. Then he went up the slope where the machine guns were firing. Quote, "I had no time now to do nothing but watch them there German machine gunners and give them the best I had. Every time I saw a German, I just took him down. At first I was shooting from a prone position, that is, lying down, just like we often shoot at the targets in the shooting matches in the mountains of Tennessee, and it was just about the same distance. But the targets here were bigger. I just couldn't miss a German's head or body at that distance, and I didn't." York took down the machine gunners one by one with his rifle, hoping he wouldn't run out of ammunition. When groups of Germans approached him, he held his M1 1911 Colt .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol and shot just as he used to shoot at wild turkeys back home, from last to first, so that no one would be able to take cover. York yelled at his enemies, asking them to surrender, as he didn't want to kill more people. Then Lieutenant Vollmer approached him and conceded, shouting at the remaining German shooters to do the same. Vollmer had thought that he was caught in the middle of a larger surprise attack, but he had no time to reconsider. York lined up his prisoners and proceeded to cross the valley with them. Upon his arrival at the American front, York's battalion adjutant, Lieutenant Joseph A. Woods, remarked, quote, "Well, York, I hear you have captured the whole German army." "No, sir," he replied. "I only got 132.